Hello everybody, we're going to get started on the blood cell project, and I've posted a couple of examples of the kind of thing that we're going to work towards in Blackboard. So make sure you review those before we get started. And the concept here is that we are going to explore thinking particles to achieve the effect that we're going for. Now, the goal for this project is to simulate looking inside a vein at blood flow, and we'll create a really stylized animation that simulates blood cells kind of tumbling through a vein. And we'll do that using, as I mentioned, thinking particles. Now, thinking particles are different than standard particles. We've looked at particles where you establish an emitter and you can apply effectors to it. They work very similar, but they're kind of different components. And some of the concepts are the same, but particles are not the same thing as thinking particles, and you will need the studio version of Cinema 4D in order to do this. So all of these assets are available with the demo version. If you're using the demo studio version, they're available, and certainly all of the Tri-C machines have the studio version as well. So what I want to do is kind of give you a general tour of thinking particles and how to establish a basic thinking particles setup. So the first thing that we need to do is establish a thinking particles emitter. Now, the easiest place to find a thinking particles emitter is in the content manager. And I'm going to access the content manager by clicking on this little icon here, the last icon to the right. You can also go to Window, Content Browser. And once you go into the content browser, we're looking for presets. We're going to dig into Studio, Simulation, Thinking Particles. Once we get into Thinking Particles, we want to go into presets. And once we're in presets, we want to focus on emitters. Now, I'm going to double click on emitters, and this gives us a whole list of different kinds of emitters to get started with. Now, thinking particles, or TP particles, are much more complex and have many more dependencies than standard emitters. They work in some ways very similar to standard particles, but there's a couple more hoops to jump through. It's still very simple, but there are a few more hoops to jump through. Now, as we push forward, I'll encourage you to experiment with some of the alternative options that are available inside thinking particles. It's a little bit more complex to get them working, but it's still very intuitive. So things are very straightforward. What I'm looking for is I'm looking for just a TP standard emitter. So here it is. Here's the TP standard emitter. I'm going to double click. And once I do that, I've established a TP standard emitter. Now, once I have the standard emitter in place, I'll just close the content browser for a minute, and I hit the play button, and this works. It looks just the same as a standard emitter. Now, before I get too far into this presentation, I'm going to expand my timeline so I have more frames to deal with. So I'm going to establish my end frame at 300, and I'm going to rewind the playhead and hit play, and you can see that I have a number of particles that are being generated. And of course, if I give that a quick render, we don't see anything. Now, in some ways, just like standard emitters, if I just take some geometry, I'll make that geometry a bit smaller. If I select the standard emitter object and I look down into the attributes manager, you can see that there's a particle shape. Now, if I take the cube object that I created and drag that into the particle shape and release that, my intuition tells me that that's how to get this set up. But when I hit play and I give that a quick render, I don't see anything happening here. So there's one more step that we need in order to generate this geometry. Now, we could dig through the attributes manager and look for that show geometry, but just like we did in the standard emitter, but that option is not there. And there's actually one more object that we need in the object manager in order to get these particles to render. So let me hit play. I'll generate some particles, give that a quick render. Now the only thing that we see is the original object that we have here. I'm going to go up under the simulation menu and go under the thinking particles menu, and I gotta have particle geometry. The minute I have particle geometry, it takes the standard emitter any geometry that we've placed inside the particle shape, it actually generates that geometry. Okay, so let me just wipe all this out and I'll review that really quickly. Let me rewind the playhead and hit play. So there's three things that we need in order to get thinking particles to work properly initially. And that is to go into the content browser. I'm going to go into presets, simulation, thinking particles, presets, emitters, and double click on TP standard emitter. Once I have a standard emitter inside the scene, I can generate whatever geometry I want. I'll make this geometry much smaller. I'm going to select the emitter object and drag the geometry into the particle shape field. Okay? And then finally I can go to simulation, thinking particles, particle geometry, and now when I hit the playhead, when I have all of those three scenarios set up and I hit the render button, I can see the particles that are being generated. Okay, so that's the just to establish thinking particles. Now what we're going to do is in the next presentation I'll back up a little bit and I'll think about modeling the blood cell that I want to use just to establish the basic animation first. Then we'll focus on some additional effects and some staging and some lighting and the rest of our scene. And very quickly we'll be at the point where we establish a really quick and effective animation for blood cells. So we'll catch up in the next presentation.